Sarah clutches her last $20 bills as she stares at the crumbling cabin buried deep in the Montana woods. Her two young children shiver behind her, their breath visible in the crisp autumn air. The neighbors called her crazy for buying this abandoned wreck with winter approaching, but Sarah sees something they don't. Beneath the rotting boards and broken windows lies a mystery that could change everything. The previous owner left suddenly 30 years ago, leaving behind more than just an empty house. As Sarah begins clearing debris from the main room, her flashlight reveals something extraordinary hidden beneath the floorboards. What she discovers will not only save her family from homelessness, but unlock secrets that powerful people have spent decades trying to bury. But why was this cabin really abandoned? And what lengths will others go to keep its secrets buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months ago, Sarah Morrison had been a different person entirely. She'd had a job as an administrative assistant at Billings General Hospital, a small apartment with reliable heat, and the comfortable illusion that her marriage to David was simply going through a rough patch. Then came the diagnosis that changed everything, not a medical one, but the brutal realization that her husband of 10 years had been systematically draining their joint accounts to fund his gambling addiction. The divorce papers were filed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, David had disappeared with what remained of their savings, leaving behind only mounting debts and a foreclosure notice. Sarah found herself staring at eviction papers while 8-year-old Emma asked why Daddy wasn't coming home for dinner anymore. "Mom, why are we here?" Emma's voice cut through the November wind as they stood before the cabin for the first time. Her dark hair whipped around her face, and her thin jacket, too small after a growth spurt they couldn't afford to accommodate, barely protected her from the cold. 6-year-old Jake pressed closer to his mother's leg, his wide eyes taking in the sagging roof and broken windows. "It looks scary," he whispered. Sarah knelt down to their level, her hands finding their cold faces. "I know it doesn't look like much right now, but this is going to be our new home. We're going to fix it up together, make it warm and cozy." The cabin sat on 5 acres of dense forest, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that had nearly claimed her old Honda's suspension on the drive. She'd bought it sight unseen at a county auction for $800, money she'd scraped together by selling her wedding ring and every piece of jewelry she owned. The auctioneer had seemed almost apologetic when her bid went unchallenged. "Nobody wants that old place," he'd told her afterward. "Been sitting empty for 30 years. Folks around here say it's cursed." Now, standing before the structure, Sarah understood why. The cabin leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from decades of fighting Montana winters. Moss grew thick on the north-facing walls, and several window panes were cracked or missing entirely. The front porch sagged under the weight of fallen branches and accumulated debris. But Sarah saw potential where others saw decay. The foundation appeared solid, massive stones that had weathered decades without shifting. The roof, while damaged, had good bones. Most importantly, it was theirs. No landlord could evict them, no bank could foreclose. Whatever happened next, they would face it with shelter over their heads. "Come on," she said, producing a key that looked almost comically oversized. "Let's see what we're working with." The door stuck at first, swollen from years of moisture, but finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Inside, filtered sunlight revealed dust motes dancing in the stale air. The main room was larger than Sarah had expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and wide plank floors that, despite decades of neglect, showed signs of quality craftsmanship. Emma and Jake clung to her sides as they explored, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The kitchen was primitive, but functional, a cast-iron sink, open shelving, and space for a wood-burning stove. 2 bedrooms branched off the main area, both small but adequate. "The windows are all broken," Emma observed, ever practical. "We'll fix them," Sarah replied, though she had no idea how. She'd never done home repairs beyond changing light bulbs, but desperation was a powerful teacher, and she was a fast learner. As they moved through the cabin, Sarah began mentally cataloging what needed immediate attention. The roof leaks were the priority. She could see water stains on the ceiling in several places, then the windows, basic cleaning and somehow figuring out heating before the real cold set in. In the largest bedroom, Jake called out with excitement, "Mom, look, there's something weird about this floor." Sarah hurried over to where he was pointing. Indeed, there was something unusual about the floorboards in this section. While the rest of the room featured uniform planks running east to west, a small area near the far wall had boards running perpendicular to the others. The wood was slightly different too, newer looking, as if it had been replaced sometime after the original construction. She knelt down and ran her hands over the boards. They felt loose, as if they hadn't been properly nailed down. When she pressed on one end, the other lifted slightly. "Emma, go get my purse from the car," Sarah said, her heart beginning to race. There should be a small flashlight in the side pocket. As Emma ran outside, Sarah continued examining the strange flooring. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that this section was hiding something. The boards were definitely loose, almost like a removable panel. Emma returned with the flashlight, and Sarah clicked it on, directing the beam at the gaps between the boards. She could see darkness beneath, suggesting empty space rather than the packed earth or foundation she would have expected. Whatever lay hidden beneath these floorboards, someone had taken great care to conceal it. And after 30 years of abandonment, Sarah Morrison and her children were the first people positioned to uncover it. Sarah worked the loose floorboards with her fingers until she could lift one end high enough to grip properly. The wood came up easier than expected, revealing a rectangular opening about 2 feet wide and 3 feet long. Emma and Jake crowded closer, their earlier fears forgotten in the excitement of discovery. "What's down there?" Jake whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever secrets lay hidden. Sarah directed the flashlight beam into the opening. The light revealed a shallow cavity, perhaps 18 inches deep, carved directly into the earth beneath the cabin's foundation. And there, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled canvas, sat a collection of objects that had been waiting 3 decades for someone to find them. "Stay back, kids," Sarah said, though her own curiosity was burning, just as brightly. She reached down and carefully lifted out the first item, a brass mining lamp, the kind she'd seen in old Western movies. Despite its age, the metal gleamed as if it had been polished recently, protected by the careful wrapping. "That's really old," Emma observed, her practical mind already working. Like from the cowboy times. Sarah set the lamp aside and reached for the second item, a leather portfolio tied with string. Inside, she found papers covered in careful handwriting, some official-looking documents with raised seals, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps. The third item made her catch her breath. It was a small wooden box, heavy for its size, with intricate carvings on the lid. When she opened it, she found old photographs, more papers, and something that made her heart race, rolls of what were unmistakably old bills. Currency from an earlier era. "Mom, you're shaking," Emma said with concern. Sarah realized her daughter was right. Her hands were trembling as she held the wooden box. Whatever they'd stumbled upon, it was significant. People didn't hide everyday items beneath floorboards and abandon them for 30 years. "We need to be very careful with these things," she told the children. "They might be important, historic even." She gathered everything carefully and moved to the kitchen table, where better light from the broken windows allowed her to examine their find more closely. The mining lamp was definitely antique, with Blackwood Mining Co. engraved in small letters near the base. The name meant nothing to her, but the lamp was clearly well made and valuable. The leather portfolio contained the most intriguing items. The first document was a property deed, yellowed, with age, bearing the name Henry Blackwood, and dated 1962. According to the deed, Henry Blackwood had owned not just this cabin, but nearly 1,000 acres of surrounding forest land. "Henry Blackwood," Sarah murmured, testing the name. "So that's who used to live here." The maps were even more interesting, Hand-drawn in careful detail, they showed the cabin's location relative to various landmarks, streams, rock formations, and what appeared to be mining sites marked with small crosses. One map bore the notation "Survey, 1963" in the same careful handwriting. But it was the photographs in the wooden box that truly brought Henry Blackwood to life. The images showed a man in his 40s or 50s, dressed in the practical clothes of someone who worked outdoors. In several photos, he stood beside mining equipment, or in front of what appeared to be mine entrances. In others, he was at this very cabin, but the cabin looked completely different, well-maintained, with a garden and outbuildings that no longer existed. The money in the box was old, but legal tender. Bills from the 1950s and early 1960s. Sarah counted carefully and found nearly $300, a significant sum for that era, and still meaningful now. Why would someone hide all this stuff and then just leave? Emma asked, studying one of the photographs. It was a good question, and Sarah found herself wondering the same thing. Everything she'd discovered suggested that Henry Blackwood had been a man of some means, someone with property and business interests. The care with which these items had been hidden suggested he'd intended to return for them. So why hadn't he? As afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would drive into the nearest town, Pine Ridge, according to the maps, and try to learn more about Henry Blackwood. Someone there would remember him, might know why he'd disappeared and left everything behind. That evening, they ate a cold dinner by flashlight and prepared to spend their first night in the cabin. Sarah had found some old blankets in a closet, musty but serviceable, and she made beds for the children on the floor of the main room near the fireplace, even though they had no way to start a fire yet. "Mom," Jake said, as she tucked him in, "do you think Mr. Blackwood is coming back for his stuff?" Sarah looked at the collection of artifacts they'd arranged on the kitchen table. The brass lamp caught the last of the evening light filtering through the broken windows, and for a moment she could almost imagine Henry Blackwood himself sitting at this table, planning whatever adventure or business venture these maps represented. "I don't think so, sweetheart," she said softly. "I think Mr. Blackwood left these things for someone like us to find, someone who would take care of them." As the children drifted off to sleep, Sarah sat at the table studying the maps by flashlight. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that Henry Blackwood's story was far from over. And somehow finding his hidden cache had made her feel less like a desperate woman hiding from failure and more like an explorer on the verge of a great discovery. The Pine Ridge Public Library occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store and a diner that advertised home cooking. Since Sarah had left Emma and Jake exploring the children's section while she approached the reference desk, with Henry Blackwood's papers carefully tucked in a folder. The librarian was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her name tag read Dorothy Chen. "I'm hoping you might help me research someone who used to live in this area," Sarah began. "A man named Henry Blackwood. He owned property out near Miller's Creek in the 1960s. Dorothy's expression immediately shifted to one of interest and something else, surprise, perhaps even recognition. "Henry Blackwood," she repeated slowly. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. You're not the first person to come asking about him, though most of the others were, well, they weren't as polite about it as you're being." "Others have been looking for him?" "Oh yes. Over the years we've had various people come through, some claiming to be distant relatives, others saying they were researching local history. But between you and me, most of them had the look of folks who thought old Henry might have left something valuable behind." Dorothy led Sarah to a corner table and disappeared into the stacks, returning with a thick folder and several bound volumes of local newspapers. "Henry Blackwood was quite the figure around here in the 50s and early 60s, Dorothy explained, opening the folder. "Started with a small mining claim up in the hills and built it into one of the most successful operations in the county. Blackwood Mining Company employed nearly 50 men at its peak." The folder contained newspaper clippings, business records, and several photographs. Sarah recognized Henry immediately from the pictures she'd found, but these showed him in a different context. at ribbon cuttings, charity events, and business meetings. He'd clearly been a prominent member of the community. He was generous too, Dorothy continued. Funded the new wing of the elementary school, donated equipment to the volunteer fire department. Folks respected him. What happened to him? Why did he leave? Dorothy's expression grew more serious. That's where the story gets complicated. In early 1963, Henry started acting different, nervous, looking over his shoulder. He came in here several times, asking to see old property records, mining surveys, legal documents. He was researching his own land holdings, which struck me as odd since he'd owned that property for years. She opened one of the newspaper volumes to a page dated March 9. The headline read, "Local mining operation faces federal investigation." The federal government had started looking into mining operations across the state. Dorothy explained, environmental errands mostly, but also some questions about mineral rights and land use permits. Henry's operation was flagged for review. Farah scanned the article, noting that while the investigation was presented as routine, there were hints of more serious concerns about improper extraction methods and disputed territorial claims. But that's not the strange part, Dorothy continued, flipping to another page. Look at this. The headline from May 1963 read, "Blackwood Mining Suddenly Ceases Operations." The accompanying article was brief, stating only that Henry Blackwood had voluntarily shut down all mining activities and that he was unavailable for comment. He just disappeared, Dorothy said. One day he was here, the next his house was empty, his mining equipment abandoned, left everything behind and vanished. Did anyone ever find out why? Dorothy lowered her voice. There were rumors. Some folks said he'd discovered something up in those hills that the government didn't want him to find. Others thought he'd gotten crosswise with some powerful people who had their own interests in his land. She pulled out a manila envelope from the back of the folder. About 10 years ago, I started collecting these letters and documents that various people have brought in over the years, all related to Henry Blackwood. Inside the envelope, Sarah found fragments of what appeared to be diary pages, written in the same careful handwriting she'd seen on the maps. The entries were dated from early 1963, and they painted a picture of a man growing increasingly paranoid and fearful. January 15, 1963. They came to the mining site again today. Same men in suits, asking the same questions about my permits and mineral rights. Something isn't right about this. Their questions are too specific, too focused on the eastern section of my claims. February 3, 1963. Found evidence that someone has been on my property without permission. Boot prints near the cabin, and some of my equipment has been moved. I'm going to start keeping important documents in a safe place. February 20, 1963. The federal investigators visited again, but this time they brought a geologist. They spent hours examining rock samples from the areas I've been working. When I asked what they were looking for, they said it was classified information related to national security. Sarah's heart raced as she read. The eastern section Henry mentioned would include the area where her cabin sat. March 10, 1963. I think I'm being watched. The same car has driven past my cabin 3 times this week, always slowing down at my driveway. I've decided to secure my most important papers and maps. If something happens to me, at least there will be a record of what I've discovered. Dorothy watched Sarah's face as she read. You've found something, haven't you? Something Henry left behind. Sarah looked up from the diary fragments, her mind racing. I bought his old cabin. When we were cleaning it out, we found some things he'd hidden. Maps, papers, photographs. And now you're wondering why someone would hide those things and then disappear forever. Exactly. From what you're showing me, he was a successful businessman, a pillar of the community. Why would he just walk away from everything? Dorothy leaned closer. Because I don't think he walked away, dear. I think Henry Blackwood discovered something in those hills that certain people didn't want discovered. And I think they made sure he couldn't tell anyone about it. The implications of Dorothy's words settled over Sarah like a cold wind. She thought about the careful way Henry had hidden his papers, the fear evident in his diary entries, the sudden disappearance that left no trace. "There's something else," Dorothy said, reaching into her desk drawer. "This came in the mail about 3 months ago. It's addressed to anyone researching Henry Blackwood. I was saving it for someone who seemed to have a legitimate interest in the truth." She handed Sarah a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message: "Henry Blackwood found something the government wanted buried. He refused to stay quiet. If you found his papers, be very careful who you trust." Sarah spread Henry's hand-drawn maps across the cabin's kitchen table, comparing them to a modern geological survey she'd found at the library. What she discovered made her hands shake with excitement and fear in equal measure. The maps aligned perfectly with areas marked on the geological survey as high mineral content, rare earth elements. Henry hadn't just been mining for gold or silver. He'd been sitting on deposits of materials that were now essential for modern technology. Materials worth millions of dollars per ton. "Mum, there's a car coming," Emma called from her position by the front window, where she'd been reading while keeping watch, as Sarah had instructed. Sarah quickly gathered the maps and tucked them into Henry's leather portfolio. Through the broken window, she could see a black SUV navigating the rutted driveway, moving slowly and deliberately like a predator approaching prey. The vehicle stopped 50 yards from the cabin, and 2 men in expensive suits climbed out. They looked completely out of place in the wilderness setting. City men with polished shoes and briefcases, the kind of people who belonged in boardrooms, not on abandoned mining claims. "Stay inside with Jake," Sarah told Emma. "No matter what happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Sarah stepped onto the sagging front porch, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The men approached with practiced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Miss Morrison," the taller of the 2 men extended his hand. "I'm Robert Hayes from Meridian Development Corporation. This is my colleague, James Park. We understand you recently acquired this property." Sarah didn't take his offered hand. "How did you know my name? And how did you know I was here?" "Property records are public information," Hayes replied smoothly. "We make it our business to stay informed about real estate transactions in areas where we have interests." "What kind of interests?" Park stepped forward, his smile even less convincing than his partner's. "Meridian Development specializes in land acquisition for commercial and industrial projects. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for this property. The cabin isn't for sale." Hayes chuckled as if Sarah had made an amusing joke. "Ms. Morrison, let's be realistic. You paid $800 for a structure that's barely habitable. We're prepared to offer you $50,000 cash, with closing in 30 days. The figure was staggering, more money than Sarah had seen in years, enough to solve all her immediate problems. But something in the men's demeanor made her instinctively suspicious. They were too eager, too prepared, and their presence here so soon after her library research felt like more than coincidence. "That's very generous," she said carefully, "but I'm not interested in selling." The pleasant expressions on both men's faces flickered slightly. Hayes opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick contract. "Perhaps you should reconsider," he said, his tone hardening slightly. "This area isn't suitable for permanent residents. No reliable utilities, difficult access, harsh winters. It's really not a place to raise children." The subtle threat in his words made Sarah's protective instincts flare. "My children are fine. We're making the cabin habitable. Are you?" Park looked pointedly at the broken windows and sagging roof. The county building inspector might have concerns about children living in substandard conditions. Social Services takes those reports very seriously. Sarah's blood ran cold. They were threatening to take Emma and Jake away from her. "You can't just—" "We're not threatening anyone," Hayes interrupted, his voice now completely devoid of warmth. "We're simply pointing out practical realities. This property has complications. The previous owner left under unfortunate circumstances. There are ongoing legal questions about mineral rights, environmental assessments, federal oversight issues." "What kind of federal oversight?" The 2 men exchanged glances. Hayes closed his briefcase with deliberate precision. Morrison, there are forces at work here that are much larger than your family's immediate housing needs. Some properties carry baggage from previous uses. This land falls into that category. For your own safety and that of your children, we strongly advise you to accept our offer and relocate somewhere more suitable. Sarah felt a surge of defiance. These men clearly knew about Henry Blackwood's discoveries, knew why the land was valuable, and they were trying to intimidate her into giving it up for a fraction of its worth. I said the property isn't for sale. I'd like you to leave now. Park stepped closer, his polite facade completely gone. Ma'am, you don't understand the situation you're in. This isn't just about money. There are national security interests involved here, federal agencies that take a dim view of civilians interfering with classified operations. Classified operations? This is private property, property that sits on top of strategically important mineral deposits, Hayes said bluntly. Property that the United States government has a vested interest in controlling. Henry Blackwood learned that lesson the hard way. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Sarah realized these men had just confirmed her worst suspicions about Henry's disappearance. Did you kill him? She asked quietly. Hayes smiled, a cold expression that chilled Sarah to the bone. Henry Blackwood chose to be uncooperative. He disappeared, along with certain documents that belonged to the federal government. If those documents were to surface now, it would create complications for everyone involved. Sarah's mind raced. They knew about Henry's hidden papers, knew she had probably found them. They were here to retrieve the documents and eliminate any witnesses to whatever had happened 30 years ago. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Of course you don't, Park said sarcastically. Just like you haven't spent the morning at the Pine Ridge Library researching Henry Blackwood. Just like you haven't found certain items hidden in this cabin. They'd been watching her, following her movements. Sarah realized with growing horror that she and her children were in serious danger. You have 48 hours to reconsider our offer, Hayes said, pulling a business card from his pocket. After that, the situation becomes much more complicated. For everyone, the two men walked back to their SUV with the confident stride people accustomed to getting their way. As they drove away, Sarah sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly weak. Through the window, she could hear Emma comforting Jake, who had started crying during the confrontation. Her children were depending on her to protect them, but she was facing forces far beyond her understanding or ability to fight. Sarah looked at the business card Hayes had left behind. Below the Meridian Development logo was a phone number and an address in Washington, D.C., but it was the small print at the bottom that made her blood freeze. A subsidiary of Blackwater Federal Contractors. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every sound from the forest, every creaking branch, every rustling leaf made her heart race. She'd moved Emma and Jake's makeshift beds into the bedroom, farthest from the main road, and positioned herself between them and any potential threat. At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep entirely. Taking Henry's flashlight, she seized a systematic search of the cabin, looking for anything else he might have hidden. If Meridian Development was this desperate to get the property, there had to be more than just maps and old photographs. The main room yielded nothing new, but in the smaller bedroom, Sarah noticed something odd about the stone fireplace. Most of the rocks were local granite, weathered and natural, but one stone near the base looked different. Smoother, more deliberately placed. She pressed against it, experimentally, and felt it give slightly. Working carefully with her fingers, she managed to work the stone loose. Behind it was a cavity, and inside that cavity was something that made her gasp aloud. A hidden safe, small but professional grade, with a combination lock that looked far more sophisticated than anything a simple mining operation would have needed. The safe was built directly into the cabin's foundation, suggesting Henry had planned this hiding place when the cabin was constructed. Sarah stared at the safe's dial, her mind racing. Henry had been careful about everything else. The maps, the photographs, the diary entries. He wouldn't have locked away his most important secrets without leaving some way for the right person to find them. She returned to the kitchen table where she'd spread out all of Henry's documents. Going through them again with fresh eyes, she looked for anything that might be a combination, dates, numbers, anything that seemed significant. The property deed was dated 1962. The mining survey was from Nice. The photographs were undated, but one showed Henry standing next to a sign that read, Blackwood Mining Company, Est, 1959. Sarah tried various combinations, 1962, 1963, 1959. Nothing worked. She tried Henry's apparent age in the photographs, estimated at around 45. Still nothing. Then she noticed something she'd missed before. In one of the diary fragments, Henry had written, March 15, 1963. Today marks exactly 30 months since I filed my first mineral rights claim. If I'd known then what I know now, 30 months from March 15, 1963, would put his original claim date in September 1960. Sarah tried R960 and heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The safe door swung open, revealing documents that made everything else look insignificant by comparison. The first item was a thick manila folder marked Classified Project Deepwater in red letters. Inside were government documents, official correspondence, and geological surveys that painted a picture Sarah could barely comprehend. The mineral deposits beneath Henry's property weren't just valuable, they were strategically critical to national defense. The rare earth elements in these hills were essential for advanced military technology, satellite systems, and nuclear applications. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. According to the documents, the federal government had known about these deposits since 1961. They'd classified the information and begun secretly acquiring surrounding properties through shell companies and forced sale. Henry's land was the final piece they needed for complete control of the entire deposit. A letter dated February 1963, addressed to Henry personally, laid out the government's position in stark terms. Mr. Blackwood, your continued operation of mining activities in the designated area compromises national security interests. You will cease all extraction activities immediately and prepare for federal acquisition of your property under eminent domain provision. Failure to comply will result in severe consequences. Henry's handwritten response, never sent according to a note in the margin, was defiant. This is still America. You cannot simply steal a man's property because you've decided it's convenient. I know my rights, and I will not be intimidated. But the most damning document was a memorandum from someone identified only as Director, Special Operations to Field Team Alpha. The date was March 20, 1963, just 5 days before Henry's disappearance. Subject has refused all reasonable offers for property acquisition. Subject possesses detailed knowledge of mineral composition and extraction sites that could compromise operational security if disclosed. Recommend immediate implementation of Protocol 7. Ensure all documentation is recovered. No witnesses. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the final line. Authorization granted. Make it look accidental. Rural areas provide excellent cover for equipment failures and natural hazards. They had murdered Henry Blackwood, not just killed him, but planned it with bureaucratic precision, then covered it up for 30 years. And now she and her children had stumbled into the same deadly situation. The safe contained one more item, a manila envelope, with insurance written across it in Henry's careful handwriting. Inside were photocopies of everything else, plus additional photographs showing government vehicles at the mining sites, federal agents surveying the property, and meetings between officials and representatives of various mining companies. Henry had been building a case, documenting everything he could about the government's illegal activities. He'd known they were planning to silence him and had prepared evidence that could expose the entire operation. At the bottom of the envelope was a letter addressed to whoever finds this. Sarah opened it with shaking hands. If you are reading this, then I am probably dead, and you are in great danger. The men who killed me will not hesitate to kill you and your family to protect their secrets. But you have a choice I didn't have. You can make this evidence public before they can stop you. The truth about what happened here must be told, no matter the cost. Don't trust local law enforcement. Some of them are compromised. Go straight to the federal level, but be careful who you trust. Not everyone in the government is part of this conspiracy. The letter was signed and dated March 22, 1963, 2 days before Henry's disappearance. Sarah looked at the evidence spread before her, proof of murder, government corruption, and a cover-up that had lasted 3 decades. She held in her hands the power to bring down powerful people and expose crimes that had been buried with Henry Blackwood's body. But she also held a death sentence for herself and her children if these people discovered what she'd found. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the broken windows. Sarah had less than 48 hours before Meridian Development expected her answer, and she now knew that saying no would likely result in the same fate that had befallen Henry Blackwood. She carefully returned all the documents to the safe, memorizing the combination. Whatever she decided to do, she needed to be smart about it. Henry had tried to fight them alone and died for it, but Sarah had something Henry hadn't. The knowledge that she was fighting not just for herself, but for her children's lives. And that made her far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. Sarah spent the morning making copies of the most critical documents at the Pine Ridge Library, her heart racing every time someone entered the building. She'd hidden the originals in a new location, inside the cabin's cast-iron stove, wrapped in plastic and secured behind a false back panel Henry had installed, but it was while exploring the cabin's small root cellar that she made another discovery that changed everything. Behind shelves stocked with decades-old canned goods, she found Henry's final insurance policy, an emergency radio transmitter, military-grade and surprisingly well-preserved. The radio was more sophisticated than anything a civilian should have owned in. When Sarah managed to get it working using battery power from her car, she discovered it was still receiving signals. More importantly, stored in its memory were the last recordings Henry had made before his disappearance. She plugged in headphones and listened to Henry's voice, speaking from 30 years in the past, his words crackling through the static of time. March 22nd, 11:47 p.m. This is Henry Blackwood, broadcasting on emergency frequency. If anyone receives this transmission, I want it on record that I am in immediate danger from agents of the United States government. They have been pressuring me to surrender my property for a classified mining operation. I have refused, and now they are planning to kill me. Sarah's breath caught as she listened to the fear in Henry's voice, a stark contrast to the confident businessman she'd seen in photographs. I have documented everything, the threats, the illegal surveillance, the attempts to force me off my land. The mineral deposits thereafter contain rare earth elements critical to weapons development. They're willing to commit murder to control them. I'm transmitting the coordinates of where I've hidden the evidence. If something happens to me, someone needs to tell the world what really occurred here. The transmission continued with Henry reading off longitude and latitude coordinates, technical specifications of the mineral deposits, and names of government officials involved in the conspiracy. But it was his final words that made Sarah's blood run cold. They're here. I can see their vehicles approaching. 3 black cars, government plates. I'm going to try to reach the old mine shaft in Devil's Canyon. If I don't make it, remember that Harold Blackwood was a patriot who loved his country but refused to let his government become something evil. Tell my sister Martha that The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Sarah rewound and listened again, this time writing down every detail she could catch. The coordinates Henry mentioned would be invaluable to authorities, but more importantly, he'd provided a clear timeline of events and named specific officials. She was so absorbed in the recording that she almost missed the sound of vehicles approaching. Looking out the window, Sarah saw not 1 but 3 black SUVs making their way up the dirt road. Her 48-hour deadline apparently meant nothing to Meridian Development. "Emma, Jake," she called urgently. "We need to leave, right now." The children responded to the panic in her voice without question, grabbing the backpacks Sarah had prepared that morning. She'd learned from Henry's mistake. Unlike him, She wouldn't face this threat alone and unprepared. They slipped out the cabin's back door and into the dense forest, following a deer path Sarah had scouted earlier. Behind them she could hear car doors slamming and voices calling out commands. Through the trees she glimpsed men in tactical gear surrounding the cabin. These weren't the polite businessmen from yesterday. These were professionals, armed and dangerous, and they were done playing games. Sarah led her children deeper into the woods, following the path toward an old logging road she'd spotted on Henry's maps. The emergency radio was in her backpack, along with copies of the most critical documents and the coordinates from Henry's final transmission. They reached the logging road just as Sarah heard the first explosion. Through the trees she could see smoke, mows from the direction of the cabin. They were destroying the evidence, eliminating any trace of Henry's hidden materials. But they were too late. Sarah had already copied everything, and now she had Henry's radio recordings as well. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had leverage. Her cell phone had no signal in the deep woods, but the logging road would eventually connect to the main highway. Once they reached civilization, Sarah could contact the authorities, not local law enforcement, as Henry had warned, but federal agencies that might still have honest people willing to investigate a 30-year-old murder and its modern-day cover-up. "Mom, where are we going?" Emma asked as they hurried along the rutted road. "Somewhere safe, baby, somewhere those men can't find us." But even as Sarah said the words, she wondered if such a place existed. The people chasing them had vast resources, government connections, and a willingness to kill that had already been demonstrated once. Henry Blackwood had tried to run, and they'd caught him. What made her think she could succeed where he had failed? The answer came to her as they walked. Unlike Henry, she wasn't trying to fight them alone. She had evidence, recordings, and most importantly, she had something worth fighting for that was bigger than herself. Emma and Jake deserved to grow up in a world where the government couldn't murder citizens for refusing to surrender their property. As they emerged from the forest onto a paved road, Sarah saw a payphone outside an abandoned gas station. It was time to make the call that would either save her family or seal their fate. She dialed the number for the FBI's Montana field office and waited for someone to answer. "FBI, Agent Martinez speaking." "Agent Martinez, my name is Sarah Morrison, and I have evidence of a federal conspiracy involving murder, illegal land acquisition, and government cover-up spanning 30 years. I need immediate protection for myself and my children, and I need to speak to someone who can guarantee our safety while I turn over this evidence." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to repeat that, and I need you to tell me exactly where you are right now." Sarah looked back toward the forest where smoke was still rising from the cabin that had briefly been their home. Henry Blackwood's final gamble was now hers to play. The only question was whether 30 years had been long enough for there to be honest people left in the government, willing to listen to the truth. Agent Martinez arrived within 2 hours, accompanied by a full FBI investigative team and a U.S. Marshal who introduced herself as Deputy Marshal Catherine Walsh. Sarah had spent those 2 hours at the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Office under protective custody that felt more like imprisonment until she was certain who she could trust. "Miss Morrison," Agent Martinez said as he reviewed the documents. Sarah had spread across the conference table. "What you're alleging here is extraordinary. You're claiming that federal agents murdered a civilian in 1963 and have been covering it up for 3 decades. "I'm not claiming anything," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm showing you evidence, documents, photographs, and audio recordings that prove everything I've said." Deputy Marshal Walsh held up the emergency radio transmitter, her expression grim. "This is definitely military hardware, classified communications equipment that shouldn't have been in civilian hands in 1963. The fact that Henry Blackwood had it suggests he had contacts inside the government." Agent Martinez played Henry's final transmission again, his face growing more serious with each word. "If this is authentic, and our technical analysis suggests it is, then we're looking at evidence of multiple federal crimes, including conspiracy, murder, and obstruction of justice." "There's more," Sarah said, producing the manila envelope marked insurance. Henry documented everything: names, dates, photographs of federal agents conducting illegal surveillance. He knew they were going to kill him, so he preserved evidence that could expose the entire operation. Welsh spread out the photographs, her trained eye immediately recognizing surveillance techniques and government vehicles. These are professional operations, the kind of resources that would only be available to intelligence agencies or military units. The question, Martinez said, is whether the people responsible are still alive and still in positions where they can threaten you and your children. As if summoned by his words, Martinez's phone rang. He answered it, listened for several minutes, then hung up with a troubled expression. That was my supervisor in Helena. He's received calls from Washington asking about our investigation into unfounded allegations regarding classified operations. Someone very high up the food chain knows we're here. Sarah felt her stomach drop. They know I talked to you. It appears so, which means we need to move quickly before they can interfere with our investigation or threaten potential witnesses. Walsh stood and walked to the window, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon. We've got company. 3 black SUVs just pulled into the parking lot. Through the window, Sarah could see the same vehicles that had surrounded her cabin that morning. Men in suits were climbing out, moving with military precision toward the sheriff's office entrance. How did they find us so fast? Sarah asked. Because some of them never left, Martinez replied grimly. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to listen carefully. What we're dealing with here goes beyond a simple cover-up. The people involved have the resources and authority to make problems disappear permanently. The front door of the sheriff's office opened, and Sarah could hear voices in the outer room, official voices using the kind of bureaucratic language that brooked no argument. Agent Martinez, I'm Deputy Director Harrison from the Department of Internal Security. I understand you've been speaking with a woman making unfounded allegations about classified government operations. Martinez looked at Sarah, and she saw the moment of decision in his eyes. He could hand her over to these people and walk away, or he could stand up for the truth, regardless of the consequences. Deputy Director Martinez called back. We're in the middle of interviewing a witness in a federal criminal investigation. Unless you have a court order, I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside. There was a long silence from the outer room. Then footsteps approached, and the conference room door opened without permission. 3 men entered, led by someone who radiated authority, despite his unremarkable appearance. Agent Martinez, I'm afraid this matter is beyond the scope of local FBI jurisdiction. Mrs. Morrison is in possession of classified materials that pose a threat to national security. She needs to come with us immediately. What court authorized this action? Walsh demanded, stepping between Harrison and Sarah. Harrison smiled coldly. Deputy Marshal, there are certain operations that exist outside normal judicial oversight. This is one of them. Sarah stood, her hand moving protectively toward her children who had been waiting in an adjacent room. I'm not going anywhere with you. I know what happened to Henry Blackwood when he refused to cooperate. Henry Blackwood was involved in illegal mining operations that compromised national security. Harrison replied smoothly. His death was an unfortunate accident during a federal operation to secure sensitive materials. His death was murder. Sarah shot back, and I have the recordings to prove it. Harrison's expression hardened. Mrs. Morrison, you have stumbled into matters that are far beyond your understanding. The minerals beneath that property are critical to national defense. Henry Blackwood threatened to expose operations that, if revealed, could have compromised America's technological advantages during the Cold War. So you killed him for it. We protected American interests, as we will continue to do. Agent Martinez stepped forward, his badge visible. Deputy Director, I don't care what authority you think you have. This woman and her children are under federal protection as witnesses in a criminal investigation. You cannot simply take them. Harrison reached into his jacket and produced a document bearing multiple official seals. Actually, Agent Martinez, I can. This is a national security letter authorizing the detention of Mrs. Morrison and the seizure of all materials in her possession. It's signed by the Attorney General himself. Sarah looked at the document, recognizing the same kind of bureaucratic authority that had been used to threaten Henry Blackwood 3 decades earlier. But she also saw something else. Agent Martinez and Deputy Marshal Walsh were not backing down. "There's just one problem with your national security letter," Walsh said calmly. "It's dated tomorrow. Either you have remarkable foresight, or someone was very sloppy with their paperwork." Harrison glanced at the document, and Sarah saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. In that moment, she realized these people weren't invincible. They made mistakes, cut corners, relied on intimidation more than legitimate authority. "The date is irrelevant," Harrison said. "The authority remains valid." "Actually, it doesn't," Martinez replied, pulling out his own phone. "Because I've just transmitted copies of all Mrs. Morrison's evidence to the FBI director, the Attorney General's office, and 3 major newspapers. If anything happens to her or her children, the entire story goes public within hours." Sarah watched Harrison's face as he processed this information. For 30 years, these people had operated in shadows, using intimidation and violence to protect their secrets. But now, in the age of instant communication and digital media, their old methods were failing them. "This isn't over," Harrison said finally. "There are national security implications here that you don't understand." "Then help us understand them," Walsh replied. "Submit to a proper investigation, cooperate with federal authorities, and let the truth come out through legal channels." Harrison and his men left without another word, but Sarah knew they would be back. The difference was that now she had federal agents who believed her story and were willing to protect her family while the investigation proceeded. As the sound of SUV engines faded into the distance, Agent Martinez turned to Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mrs. Morrison, you've just declared war on some very powerful people. I hope you understand what that means." Sarah looked toward the room where Emma and Jake were waiting, their futures hanging in the balance of decisions made by adults they would never meet. "I understand that some things are worth fighting for," she said quietly, "and some truths are too important to stay buried." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the doorway of what had once been Henry Blackwood's cabin, watching Emma and Jake play in the yard where federal agents had once searched for evidence to destroy. The structure bore little resemblance to the crumbling ruin they'd first encountered. New windows let in warm spring sunlight, a solid roof kept out the Montana weather, and smoke from a working fireplace drifted peacefully into the clear mountain air. The transformation had been made possible by the settlement from Meridian Development Corporation, which had quietly dissolved in the aftermath of the federal investigation. The company's executives were facing charges ranging from conspiracy to murder, and their attempts to claim government immunity had been rejected by federal courts after Sarah's evidence proved their operations were illegal from the beginning. Agent Martinez knocked on the doorframe behind her, carrying a manila folder that had become a familiar sight over the past months. "The last of the depositions are complete," he said. "Deputy Director Harrison and 6 members of his team have agreed to plea bargains in exchange for testimony about the 1963 operations." Sarah accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately. She'd learned to pace herself when dealing with the ongoing legal proceeding. The truth about Henry Blackwood's murder was finally coming to light, but the process of justice was slow and often painful. "What about the mineral rights?" she asked. "That's the interesting part," Martinez replied with something approaching a smile. "According to our legal analysis, Henry Blackwood's original claims were completely legitimate. The federal government had no legal authority to force him off the land, which means you now own one of the most valuable rare earth deposits in North America." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The same minerals that had led to Henry's murder were now providing financial security for her family. The difference was that she was dealing with legitimate mining companies, operating under proper permits and environmental oversight. "There's something else," Martinez continued. "We found Henry Blackwood's remains." Sarah had been expecting this news, but it still hit her with unexpected force. Henry had been a presence in their lives for months, through his carefully preserved documents, his recorded voice, his methodical planning for a future he wouldn't live to see. Where? Devil's Canyon, just like his final transmission indicated. He made it to the old mine shaft, but was trapped there when they caused a rock slide. He left one final message carved into the stone wall. Martinez handed her a photograph showing rough letters carved into rock. "Truth will survive. Tell Martha I'm sorry." Martha was his sister, Sarah said softly. Dorothy at the library mentioned her. "Is she still alive?" "She lives in a nursing home in Billing. 93 years old, but sharp as a tack. She's been waiting 30 years for someone to tell her what really happened to her brother." That afternoon, Sarah made the drive to Billings with Emma and Jake, carrying a collection of Henry's photographs and personal items that had survived 3 decades in hiding. Martha Blackwood was a small woman with bright eyes and hands that shook slightly as she examined pictures of the brother she'd lost so long ago. "I always knew Henry didn't just disappear," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "He was too responsible, too caring to just walk away from everyone who loved him." But nobody would listen to an old woman who insisted her brother had been murdered. Sarah spent 2 hours with Martha, sharing everything she'd learned about Henry's final days and the courage he'd shown in documenting the conspiracy against him. When it was time to leave, Martha pressed a small wrapped package into Sarah's hands. "This was Henry's," she explained. "Our father's pocket watch. Henry always said it should go to someone who understood the value of time, someone who wouldn't waste the opportunities life provides." Back at the cabin that evening, Sarah opened the package to reveal a beautiful gold pocket watch, engraved with the words, "Time is the most precious gift we can share." Inside the cover was a family photograph, Henry as a young man, standing with Martha and their parents, in front of the very cabin where Sarah now lived. She showed the watch to Emma and Jake, explaining how it connected them to the family who had built their home and died protecting it. The children listened solemnly, understanding in the way that children do when adults share important truths with them. "Henry would be happy that we're here," Emma said with the certainty of an 8-year-old who had learned to trust her instincts about people, even those she'd never met. Jake nodded agreement, and we kept his stuff safe, just like he wanted. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat in Henry's restored study, now her home office where she managed the legal and financial affairs that had grown from their discovery. The emergency radio sat on a shelf, silent now but preserved as a reminder of one man's courage in the face of overwhelming odds. She opened Henry's pocket watch and listened to its steady ticking, a sound that connected past to present, loss to hope, tragedy to redemption. Outside, the Montana wind moved through trees that had witnessed both Henry's last stand and her family's new beginning. For the first time since David's betrayal had shattered her old life, Sarah felt truly at peace. She'd found more than shelter in Henry Blackwood's cabin. She'd found purpose, justice, and the knowledge that some battles, even when they span decades, are worth fighting. The watch ticked steadily in her palm, measuring moments that belonged not to the past, but to the future. A future where Emma and Jake would grow up knowing that truth matters, that courage counts, and that sometimes the greatest victories come to those who refuse to surrender hope. 3 months after Henry's watch had found its way into Sarah's hands, she stood in the cabin's main room surrounded by sawdust and the satisfying smell of fresh lumber. Emma held a level steady while Sarah marked measurements on a new beam, and Jake sorted through Henry's collection of vintage tools they'd discovered in a shed behind the property. "This one's really heavy, Mom," Jake called out, struggling to lift an old hand plane. "But look how shiny it is underneath the dust." Sarah walked over to examine the tool. Like everything else Henry had left behind, his carpentry equipment had been carefully maintained and stored. The handplane was a beautiful piece, solid steel and aged wood, the kind of tool that would last for generations if properly cared for. "Henry must have been quite the craftsman," she murmured, running her finger along the plane's smooth edge. "These tools are in better condition than some I've seen in stores." Over the past weeks, as they'd worked to restore the cabin, Sarah had developed a deep appreciation for Henry's skills. Every joint was perfectly fitted, every beam precisely placed. The man had built this structure to last, as if he'd known it would need to shelter future families through whatever storms might come. Emma picked up a small wooden box filled with hand-forged nails. Why did he make his own nails? Couldn't he just buy them at the store? He probably could have, Sarah replied, admiring the consistent craftsmanship of each nail, but Henry seemed to be the kind of person who believed in doing things the right way, even if it took longer. These nails will never rust or bend like modern ones might. The discovery of Henry's tools had transformed their renovation project from a desperate attempt at basic shelter into something approaching fine craftsmanship. Sarah found herself learning techniques that had been passed down through generations: how to fit joints without modern fasteners, how to select wood grain for strength and beauty, how to build things that would last. "Can we make something with these tools?" Jake asked, his 6-year-old enthusiasm undaunted by the complexity of the vintage equipment. Sarah considered the question. They'd been so focused on basic repairs, fixing the roof, replacing windows, installing proper insulation, that they hadn't thought about creating something new. But looking at Henry's well-organized tool collection, she realized he would have wanted these instruments of creation to be used, not just preserved as museum pieces. "Actually," she said, "an idea forming. I think we can. What would you two like to build?" Emma's response was immediate: "A bookshelf. For all the books we had to leave behind when we moved here." It was true. In their hurried departure from their old life, they'd been forced to abandon most of their possessions, including Emma's cherished collection of children's novels and Jake's picture books. The cabin had no built-in storage for books, just the functional shelving Henry had installed for practical items. "A bookshelf it is," Sarah agreed, "but we'll need to learn how to use these tools properly. Henry wouldn't want us to waste good lumber on sloppy work." That afternoon they drove to the Pine Ridge Library, where Dorothy Chen had become not just their source for information about Henry, but a friend who understood their unique situation. When Sarah explained their bookshelf project, Dorothy's face lit up. "I have just the thing," she said, disappearing into the library's back room. She returned with a slim volume titled "Traditional Woodworking Techniques" and a manila envelope labeled "Henry Blackwood, Donated Items." "Henry left this with us years ago," Dorothy explained, opening the envelope to reveal hand-drawn plans and detailed notes. "He said someday someone might need to know how to build things the old way, when quality mattered more than speed." The plans were beautiful, detailed drawings showing joinery techniques, wood selection guidelines, and step-by-step instructions for various furniture pieces. Among them was a design for a bookshelf that would fit perfectly in the cabin's main room. "He drew this for our house," Emma said with wonder, tracing the measurements with her finger. Sarah studied the plans, marveling at Henry's foresight. Even facing death threats and government conspiracy, he'd taken time to preserve knowledge that future residents might need. The bookshelf design wasn't just functional, it was elegant, with curved supports and decorative elements that would make it a beautiful addition to their home. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a note in Henry's careful handwriting at the bottom of the plan. He wrote, "A house becomes a home when it holds the stories that matter to the people who live there." Over the following days, Sarah and the children worked together to bring Henry's design to life. They learned to use his measuring tools, to cut wood with his hand saws, to fit joints with patience and precision, rather than rushing with power tools they couldn't afford anyway. Jake proved surprisingly good at sanding, his small hands able to reach corners that gave the adults trouble. Emma had an eye for measuring and marking, ensuring each cut was straight and true. Sarah discovered muscles she'd never used and a satisfaction in creating something beautiful with her own hands that she'd never experienced in her previous office-bound existence. The work was slow but meditative. Each evening after the children were asleep, Sarah would sit in the cabin's quiet main room and study Henry's plans by lamplight, preparing for the next day's tasks. She began to understand why he'd chosen to live this way. There was peace in working with your hands, in creating something substantial and lasting from raw materials and careful effort. When the bookshelf was finally complete, they stood back to admire their work. It was beautiful, solid and graceful, fitting seamlessly into the cabin's interior, as if Henry himself had built it decades ago. More importantly, it represented something none of them had possessed before, the knowledge that they could create beauty and function with their own skills and determination. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who seemed surprised to find anyone actually living at the remote cabin address. Sarah signed for it with curiosity, noting the return address of Hartwell and Associates, estate attorneys from Helena, Montana. Inside were documents that made her sit down heavily at the kitchen table: stock certificates, bearer bonds, and a letter explaining that Henry Blackwood had maintained investment accounts that had been growing untouched for 30 years. The attorney's letter was formal but clear. Following the recent legal resolution regarding Mr. Blackwood's death and the validation of his will, we are pleased to inform you that as the current legal owner of his property, you are entitled to inherit his remaining financial assets. Sarah stared at the numbers, hardly believing what she was reading. The stock certificates alone were worth nearly $2 million, investments in mining companies, technology firms, and conservative blue-chip stocks that had appreciated steadily over 3 decades. The bearer bonds added another $500,000 to the total. "Mum, what's wrong?" Emma asked, noticing Sarah's stunned expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, Sarah thought she had. Henry Blackwood continued to provide for future occupants of his cabin, even 30 years after his death. The man had planned for everything, not just preserving evidence of his murder, but ensuring that whoever inherited his property would have the resources to maintain it properly. "We're going to be okay," Sarah said softly. "More than okay, we're going to have choices." That afternoon, she called Agent Martinez to verify the legitimacy of the inheritance. His investigation had thoroughly documented Henry's financial affairs, and everything checked out. The investments were legitimate, the legal transfer was valid, and the money was clean. Henry was a smart man, Martinez told her. He diversified his investments, chose companies with long-term growth potential, and structured everything so it would pass to whoever inherited his property. He must have known that anyone willing to fight for his land would need resources to do it properly. Sarah spent the evening studying Henry's investment portfolio, amazed by his foresight. He'd bought stock in IBM when computers were barely imaginable, invested in aerospace companies before the space race began, and purchased shares in mining firms that had grown into international corporations. Every decision showed careful research and long-term thinking. The next morning brought another surprise: a visit from Dr. Patricia Williams, the principal of Pine Ridge Elementary School. Sarah invited her in for coffee, wondering what could have brought the educator to their remote location. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Williams began, "I understand your family has come into some financial stability recently. I wanted to discuss Emma and Jake's education." Sarah had been dreading this conversation. The children had been attending Pine Ridge Elementary since settling at the cabin, but their irregular attendance during the federal investigation had put them behind academically. She'd been worried about their future educational prospects. "Both children are remarkably bright," Williams continued. "Emma's reading level is well above her grade, and Jake shows exceptional spatial reasoning skills. With proper support, they could have opportunities for advanced education." "What kind of support?" Sarah asked. "Private tutoring to catch up on missed work, enrichment programs during summers, eventually preparation for college scholarships. The kind of educational foundation that opens doors." Sarah thought about the stock certificates upstairs, the financial security that Henry's foresight had provided. For the first time since David's betrayal had destroyed their old life, she could consider giving her children advantages rather than just basic necessities. How much would something like that cost? Williams named figures that would have been impossible months ago, but were now easily manageable with Henry's inheritance. Sarah realized she was facing a decision that would shape her children's entire futures. "There's something else," Dr. Williams added. "I've been researching Henry Blackwood's background since the story broke in the newspapers. Did you know he established a scholarship fund at Montana State University in 1962? Sarah shook her head. Henry's generosity continued to surprise her. The fund was designed to support students from rural areas who wanted to study engineering or earth sciences. It's been dormant since his disappearance, but with proper management, it could be reactivated. Your inheritance might include administrative rights to that fund. The idea fascinated Sarah. Henry had cared about education, about giving young people opportunities to build better lives. The scholarship fund represented his values in concrete form, investing in the future, supporting those who might otherwise lack resources, believing that knowledge and hard work could overcome any obstacle. "I'd like to learn more about that," Sarah said. That evening, as Emma practiced reading aloud and Jake worked on a puzzle that challenged his developing problem-solving skills, Sarah considered the responsibilities that came with unexpected wealth. Henry's money wasn't just an inheritance, it was a trust, carrying with it the obligation to use resources wisely and generously. She thought about her own educational dreams deferred when she'd married young and become a mother. She thought about other families who might be struggling as hers had struggled, needing just a little help to achieve stability and security. The stock certificates weren't just pieces of paper, they were choices, opportunities, the power to make decisions based on values rather than desperation. Henry Blackwood had given her something precious. The freedom to build the kind of life she wanted for her children, and the resources to help others do the same. Outside, Montana stars filled the clear night sky, the same stars Henry had seen during his final days at this cabin. Sarah felt his presence in the careful planning that continued to unfold, the generosity that reached across decades to touch lives he would never know. Tomorrow she would begin the process of managing Henry's legacy responsibly. But tonight she simply sat in grateful silence, understanding finally what it meant to inherit not just money, but the values and vision of someone who had lived and died for principles that mattered. The letter had been forwarded through 3 different addresses before reaching Sarah, its envelope worn and postmarked from Portland, Oregon. The return address read simply, E. Blackwood, in handwriting that trembled with age but remained clearly legible. Sarah opened it carefully, her heart racing with the possibility of what it might contain. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, covered in the same shaky handwriting. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," it began. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood Patterson. I am Henry Blackwood's daughter." Sarah sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the letter shaking in her hands. Henry had a daughter, a living relative who had been wondering about her father's fate for 30 years. The letter continued. "I saw the news reports about my father's death and the investigation into what happened to him. I have been trying to contact you through various official channels, but they all seem to lead to dead ends. Finally, Agent Martinez provided me with your forwarding information." Eleanor explained that she had been 22 years old when her father disappeared, newly married and living in Portland with her husband Robert. She had tried for years to learn what had happened to Henry, but every inquiry had been met with official silence and bureaucratic stonewalling. "I stopped believing he was alive sometime in the 1980s, she wrote, "but I never stopped hoping someone would eventually tell me the truth about what happened. Thank you for having the courage to bring his story to light." The letter went on to describe Eleanor's life, her career as a high school teacher, her 3 children, now adults with families of their own, her husband Robert's death from cancer 5 years earlier. She was now 75, living in a retirement community, but still sharp and independent. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand you and your children have been living in my father's cabin. I want you to know how grateful I am that someone who cared about justice and truth found his hidden evidence. My father always believed that good people would eventually triumph over corruption and greed. You proved him right." Eleanor included her phone number and a request. "If it wouldn't be too much trouble, I would love to see the place where my father lived his final years. I have so many questions about how he spent his time, what he was thinking, whether he ever spoke of me. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm hoping you might allow an old woman to visit her father's home one last time." Sarah immediately called the number Eleanor had provided. The voice that answered was warm and clear, with the same careful diction, Sarah had noticed in Henry's recorded messages. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Sarah Morrison. I just received your letter." "Oh my goodness," Eleanor said, her voice catching with emotion. "I wasn't sure you would call. Oh, I know you must be very busy with everything that's been happening." "Not too busy for Henry's daughter," Sarah replied firmly. "When would you like to visit?" They arranged for Eleanor to fly to Montana the following week. Sarah would meet her at the airport in Billings and drive her to the cabin. Eleanor mentioned that she would be bringing some items that had belonged to Henry, things she'd saved over the years in hopes of someday having a place to put them. That evening, Sarah told Emma and Jake about Eleanor's upcoming visit. The children were fascinated by the idea of meeting Henry's daughter, someone who had actually known him as a living person, rather than just a collection of documents and recordings. What was he like as a dad? Emma wondered. "We'll be able to ask her," Sarah replied. "She can tell us stories about him that we'll never find in any papers or recordings." Sarah spent the next week preparing for Eleanor's visit. She cleaned the cabin thoroughly, organized all of Henry's artifacts so Eleanor could see everything they'd discovered, and even picked wildflowers for the kitchen table, the kind of welcoming touch she imagined Henry would have appreciated. When Eleanor stepped off the plane at Billings Airport, Sarah recognized her immediately. She had Henry's eyes and the same careful, observant expression Sarah had seen in his photograph. Despite her age, Eleanor moved with purpose and dignity, carrying herself like someone accustomed to facing life's challenges with grace. "You look exactly like I imagined," Eleanor said, embracing Sarah warmly. "Someone strong enough to take on the people who killed my father." During the drive to the cabin, Eleanor shared stories about growing up with Henry. He had been a devoted father, teaching her to fish and hunt, showing her how to identify different types of rocks and minerals, instilling in her the values of hard work and honest dealing that had ultimately cost him his life. "He used to say that a person's character was measured by what they did when no one was watching," Eleanor told Sarah. "I think he would be very proud of what you've done with his evidence and his property." When they reached the cabin, Eleanor stood for a long moment just looking at the structure her father had built. Sarah watched as decades of wandering and grief finally found rose in this simple moment of homecoming. "It's smaller than I remembered," Eleanor said softly, "but it feels like him, solid, honest, built to last." Inside, Eleanor examined every item they'd found, handling each piece with the reverence of someone touching a sacred relic. She laughed with delight at seeing her father's tools, cried when she listened to his final radio transmission, and marveled at the careful planning that had preserved his evidence for 3 decades. "He never gave up hope that someone would find the truth," she said. "Even when he knew they were going to kill him, he kept working to make sure justice would eventually be served." Eleanor's visit stretched from the planned weekend to nearly 2 weeks, as she worked with Sarah to create something neither of them had expected. A museum of sorts, dedicated to preserving Henry's story and the historical importance of what had happened at the cabin. "People need to understand," Eleanor said as they carefully catalogued Henry's mining equipment in the restored shed. "What happened to my father wasn't just about one man's death. It was about whether ordinary citizens have any protection against government overreach." The Pine Ridge Historical Society had been enthusiastic about the project from the moment Eleanor proposed it. Dr. Patricia Williams had connected them with the State Historical Preservation Office, which offered both funding and expertise to help create a proper historical exhibit. Sarah found herself becoming the unofficial curator, learning about archival preservation, display techniques, and educational programming. It was work she'd never imagined doing, but it felt right, a way to honor both Henry's memory and the principles he died defending. "Look at this," Eleanor said, holding up a piece of mining equipment that Sarah hadn't fully understood. "This is a spectral analysis device. My father was using it to identify the exact mineral content of his ore samples. In 1963, this technology was barely available to universities, let alone individual miners. Sarah examined the device, recognizing now why the federal government had been so concerned about Henry's operations. He hadn't just stumbled onto valuable minerals, he'd had the knowledge and equipment to analyze exactly what he'd found and understand its strategic importance. He was trained as a geologist before he started mining. Eleanor continued. Served in the Army Corps of Engineers during World War II, worked on some classified projects related to mineral resources for military applications. That's probably how he knew the significance of what he'd discovered. This new information painted a different picture of Henry Blackwood than the simple small-town miner Sarah had imagined. He'd been an educated man, scientifically trained, with military experience and government connections. His refusal to cooperate with federal authorities hadn't been naive defiance. It had been the informed decision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Emma and Jake had become unofficial junior curators, helping to organize displays and learning more about local history than most adults knew. Emma had developed a particular fascination with the period maps and surveys, while Jake was drawn to the mining equipment and tools. "Mum, look at this," Jake called from across the shed, holding a device that looked like a cross between a compass and a telescope. "Eleanor says it's for finding which way the rocks are tilted underground. It's called a clinometer," Eleanor explained, joining them. "My father taught me to use one when I was about Emma's age. He said understanding geology was like reading the Earth's autobiography. Every rock formation tells the story of what happened millions of years ago." The historical exhibit was taking shape in the cabin's main room and extending into the restored outbuildings. Henry's story was presented chronologically, from his early mining successes through the federal investigation and ultimate cover-up. But Sarah was careful to include the broader context, the Cold War tensions that had made rare earth minerals so strategically important, the legal framework that was supposed to protect property rights, and the ongoing relevance of Henry's story to modern debates about government authority. "This isn't just ancient history," Sarah explained to a group of high school students who had come for an early preview of the exhibit. "The same tensions between individual rights and national security concerns exist today. The same questions about how much power government should have over private property are still being debated." Eleanor had brought items from her own collection that added personal depth to the historical narrative. Photographs of Henry with his young daughter, letters he'd written to her from various mining camps, report cards where he'd written proud notes about her academic achievements. These human details transformed Henry from a historical figure into a real person, a father who'd loved his daughter, a man who'd had dreams and plans beyond his mining operations. The most moving addition was a recording Eleanor had found in her own attic, a reel-to-reel tape of Henry reading bedtime stories to her when she was 6 years old. His voice was younger, happier, completely different from the fearful man captured in his final radio transmission. Sarah arranged for the tape to be digitized and included in the exhibit, giving visitors a sense of who Henry Blackwood had been before fear and conspiracy entered his life. "I want children to hear this," Eleanor said, as they listened to the restored recording. "I want them to understand that the man who died defending his principles was also someone who read Goodnight Moon with funny voices and always made sure I felt safe and loved." As the exhibit neared completion, Sarah realized it had become more than just a memorial to Henry Blackwood. It was a testament to the power of truth to survive even decades of official suppression. A reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, and a celebration of the ordinary people who choose courage over comfort when faced with forces larger than themselves. The grand opening was scheduled for the following month, with plans for a ceremony that would include federal officials who had supported the investigation, legal experts who had helped expose the conspiracy, and community members who had waited 30 years to learn the truth about their neighbor's disappearance. But for Sarah, the real victory was quieter and more personal. The knowledge that Henry's story would be preserved and shared, that his sacrifice had meaning beyond his own life, and that the cabin he'd built to shelter his own dreams was now sheltering the dreams and aspirations of another family who understood the value of standing up for what's right. The Pine Ridge Elementary School gymnasium had been transformed for the evening, filled with folding chairs and decorated with student artwork, depicting various scenes from local history. Sarah sat in the front row with Emma and Jake, watching nervously as community members filed in for what Principal Williams had called Academic Achievement Night. Sarah had tried to downplay the significance of the evening, but both children understood they were being recognized for something special. Over the past months, as they'd worked on the Henry Blackwood historical exhibit and caught up on their interrupted education, both Emma and Jake had shown remarkable academic progress. The Morrison Family Academic Excellence Awards, Dr. Williams announced, stepping to the podium. This year, we're doing something different. Instead of recognizing just individual student achievement, we're honoring a family whose dedication to learning and truth-seeking has inspired our entire school community. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. At 9 years old, she was still learning to accept praise for her accomplishments. Jake, now 7, seemed more excited by the attention, waving at classmates and teachers who had become like extended family over the past year. Emma Morrison, Williams continued, has improved her reading level by 3 full grades since enrolling at Pine Ridge Elementary. More importantly, she has shown exceptional ability in research and critical thinking, skills she developed while helping document the historical significance of her family's home. Sarah felt tears welling up as Emma walked to the front of the gymnasium to accept her certificate. The girl who had once been too shy to speak up in class was now confident enough to present historical information to visiting dignitaries and reporters. Jake Morrison, Williams said next, has demonstrated remarkable spatial reasoning and problem-solving abilities. His work cataloging historical artifacts and learning traditional woodworking techniques has shown us that hands-on learning can be just as valuable as textbook education. Jake bounded to the front with characteristic enthusiasm, his certificate nearly as large as he was. Sarah remembered the frightened little boy who had clung to her legs during their first desperate night in the cabin. That child had grown into someone confident in his abilities and secure in his place in the world. But the evening's biggest surprise came when Dr. Williams called Sarah's name. Sarah Morrison, she announced, has shown us what it means to be a lifelong learner. While caring for her children and managing complex legal and historical preservation work, she has also completed her high school equivalency degree and begun college coursework through Montana State University's distance learning program. Sarah hadn't intended to make her own education public, but Dr. Williams had discovered her enrollment when helping to coordinate the scholarship fund that Eleanor and Sarah were re-establishing in Henry's memory. The principal felt Sarah's example was too important not to share. Moreover, Williams continued, Mrs. Morrison has used her family's unique circumstances to create educational opportunities for students throughout our district. The Henry Blackwood Historical Preserve has become a hands-on learning laboratory where students can study geology, local history, government processes, and civic responsibility. As Sarah accepted her own certificate, an honorary recognition for community educational leadership, she thought about how much had changed since that desperate autumn morning when she'd first seen the rundown cabin. She'd been running from failure then, seeking nothing more than basic shelter for her children. Now she was part of something larger. The historical preserve attracted visitors from across the region. University researchers came to study the geological formations Henry had documented. Law students examined the case files as examples of how citizen courage could expose government wrongdoing. High school civics classes used Henry's story to discuss the balance between national security and individual rights. After the ceremony, Sarah mingled with other parents, teachers, and community members. She was struck by how many people mentioned that her family's story had inspired them to pursue their own educational goals or become more involved in community affairs. "You've shown us that it's never too late to learn something new," said Martha Chen, Dorothy's daughter-in-law and a substitute teacher at the school. I've decided to go back and finish my teaching degree. If you can manage college coursework while dealing with everything you've been through, I can certainly handle a few education classes. Eleanor, who had stayed in Pine Ridge to help establish the historical preserve, approached with a manila envelope. "I have something for Emma and Jake," she said, handing the package to Sarah. Inside were 2 savings account books, each showing an initial deposit of $10,000. "Henry Blackwood Educational Trust Fund," Eleanor explained. "I've been working with the bank to establish individual accounts for each child. The money will grow over time, ensuring they'll have resources for college or whatever educational paths they choose to pursue." Sarah stared at the account books, overwhelmed once again by Henry's continuing generosity. Through Eleanor's careful stewardship of his memory and values, he was still providing for children he'd never met, still investing in futures he wouldn't live to see. "There's one condition," Eleanor added with a smile. "When they're old enough, Emma and Jake will help administer the scholarship fund for other students who need educational support." Henry always believed that those who received help should find ways to help others. That night, as Sarah tucked her children into their beds in the cabin Henry had built, she reflected on the unexpected directions their lives had taken. They'd found far more than shelter in this remote mountain home. They'd found purpose, community, and the knowledge that education and courage could overcome almost any obstacle. Emma fell asleep, clutching her certificate, and Jake had carefully placed his on the bookshelf they'd built together using Henry's tools. Sarah kissed them both good night, then walked to the window to look out at the stars that had witnessed so much history in this quiet place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight she was simply grateful for Henry's legacy, Eleanor's friendship, and the community that had embraced her family when they needed it most. The business license arrived on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Sarah had first set foot in Henry Blackwood's cabin. She held the official document with trembling hands, reading the words that made her new venture official. Morrison Property Rights Advocacy, License Consulting Service, State of Montana. Emma found her mother standing in the kitchen, staring at the license with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "What's that, Mom?" "It's permission to help other people," Sarah replied, settling into a chair at the kitchen table where so many important conversations had taken place over the past year. "People who are facing the same kinds of problems we faced when we first came here." The idea had grown gradually from the dozens of phone calls and letters Sarah had received after news of Henry's story spread beyond Montana. Families facing foreclosure, property owners being pressured by development companies, small landowners discovering that their mineral rights had been claimed by corporations they'd never heard of, all reaching out to the woman who had successfully stood up to powerful interests and won. Agent Martinez had been the first to suggest that Sarah's experience fighting the federal conspiracy might be valuable to others facing similar challenges. "You've learned more about property law, mineral rights, and government procedures in the past year than most lawyers know," he'd told her. "And you understand what it feels like to be intimidated by people with more resources and authority." The consulting business would be small at first, Sarah working from the cabin's converted study, providing research and advocacy support to families who couldn't afford major legal representation. But Eleanor had helped her secure startup funding through the Henry Blackwood Trust, and several attorneys had offered to provide pro bono legal backup for cases that went to court. "Will you still be here with us?" Jake asked, his 7-year-old mind immediately concerned about any change that might disrupt their hard-won stability. "Always," Sarah assured him. "This is our home. The work I'll be doing will help make sure other families can keep their homes too." Her first official client was already scheduled to arrive that afternoon, Maria Santos, a widow from eastern Montana, whose ranch was being targeted for seizure by a mining company claiming eminent domain authority. Maria's situation had troubling similarities to Henry's experience, including federal agencies that seemed unusually eager to support the mining company's claims. Sarah had spent weeks researching Maria's case, learning about water rights, grazing permits, and the complex web of federal and state regulations that governed rural property ownership. She'd discovered irregularities in the mining companies' permits, questionable relationships between company officials and government regulators, and a pattern of targeting vulnerable property owners who lacked resources to fight extended legal battles. Mrs. Morris, Maria Santos, stood in the cabin's doorway, a weathered woman in her 60s, wearing the practical clothes of someone who worked outdoors. Her handshake was firm, but Sarah could see the worry in her eyes, the same desperate fear Sarah remembered from her own darkest moments. "Please call me Sarah. Come in. I've got coffee ready." They settled at the kitchen table, and Sarah spread out the files she'd assembled on Maria's case. The ranch had been in the Santos family for 4 generations, but recent surveys had revealed significant uranium deposits beneath the grazing land. A mining company backed by federal contracts was claiming the right to extract the minerals, offering compensation that would force Maria to relocate and abandon the only life she'd ever known. "They say it's for national security," Maria explained, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting alone for too long. "But I've seen the company's other operation. They strip the land, contaminate the water, and leave nothing but holes in the ground where families used to live." Sarah listened to Maria's story, taking detailed notes and recognizing the familiar patterns of intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation. The mining company was using many of the same tactics that had been employed against Henry Blackwood: claims of national security, pressure from federal agencies, and implied threats about what might happen to uncooperative property owners. "The good news," Sarah said, pointing to documents she'd obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, "is that their permits have some serious problems. The environmental impact assessments are incomplete. They haven't properly consulted with tribal authorities about sacred sites, and their financial bonding for land restoration is insufficient." She showed Maria how to challenge the mining company's permits, connect with environmental groups that could provide additional support, and document any intimidation tactics for potential criminal investigation. Most importantly, she helped Maria understand that she wasn't alone, that there were legal protections available to property owners willing to fight for their rights. "I can't promise we'll win," Sarah said honestly, "but I can promise you won't have to face this alone. And sometimes just knowing someone is willing to fight alongside you makes all the difference." As Maria left with copies of her research and a plan for the next steps in her legal challenge, Sarah felt a satisfaction she'd never experienced in her previous office job. This work mattered in ways that went beyond paychecks and performance reviews. She was using Henry's story and her own hard-won knowledge to help people protect what mattered most to them. That evening, Eleanor called from her retirement community in Portland. "How did it go with your first client?" she asked. "Good. I think she has a real fight ahead of her, but she has options now, and she knows someone believes her story." "My father would be so proud," Eleanor said softly. "He always said that fighting injustice was like tending a garden. You plant seeds of truth and courage, and eventually they grow into something that feeds the whole community." Sarah looked around the cabin that had become the headquarters of her unlikely new career. Henry's tools still hung in the workshop. His books lined the shelves they'd built together. His legacy lived on in every aspect of their daily lives. But now that legacy was growing, reaching beyond the boundaries of the property to touch lives Henry could never have imagined. Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she carefully turned the pages of the leather-bound Bible, its spine cracked from decades of use and its margins filled with handwritten notes in Henry's careful script. She and Sarah sat in the cabin's main room on a quiet Sunday afternoon, preparing items for what would become the final addition to the historical preserve. "I found this in my storage unit last week," Eleanor explained. "After Robert died, I packed up so many of my father's things without really looking at them. I was too emotional then to go through everything properly." The Bible had belonged to Henry's father, and then to Henry himself. The inscription on the front page read, "To Henry on his confirmation day, may these words guide you through whatever trials life brings. With love, Papa. May 15, 1938. Sarah examined the handwritten notes scattered throughout the text. Henry had been a thoughtful reader, recording his own interpretations and questions in the margins. Some entries were dated, creating a spiritual autobiography that spanned decades of his adult life. "Look at this," Eleanor said, pointing to a passage in Ecclesiastes that Henry had underlined multiple times. "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven." Below it he'd written, March 1963. "Maybe this is my time to stand for what's right, no matter the cost." Emma and Jake sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully sorting through a box of Henry's personal photographs that Eleanor had brought. Many showed Henry at various stages of his life, as a young soldier during World War II, working at early mining sites, standing proudly beside equipment and structures he'd built with his own hands. "He looks happy in most of these," Emma observed with the directness of childhood. "Even in the older ones where he looks worried, he still looks like he thought he was doing the right thing." "That's a very mature observation," Eleanor said, smiling at Emma. "My father believed that happiness came from living according to your principles, even when it was difficult. He used to tell me that a clear conscience was worth more than a full bank account." Jake held up a photograph that showed Henry with a group of other men, all wearing hard hats and covered in mining dust. "Who are these people?" "Those were his workers," Eleanor explained. "My father employed about 50 men over the years. When he had to shut down the mining operation, he made sure every one of them found other jobs. He used his own savings to provide severance pay and job placement assist." Sarah studied the photograph, seeing in those faces the human cost of Henry's principled stand. When he'd refused to cooperate with the federal conspiracy, he hadn't just risked his own life, he'd known his decision would affect the livelihoods of dozens of families who depended on his mining operation. "Did any of them ever contact you after he disappeared?" Sarah asked. "A few did. They couldn't understand why Henry would just abandon everything, leave his workers without explanation. Of course I didn't know the truth then either, so I couldn't give them answers." Eleanor pulled out one more item from her bag, a small wooden cross, hand-carved with intricate detail. "Henry made this for me when I was 10 years old. He said it would remind me that faith wasn't just about believing in God, but about having the courage to do what God expected of us." She turned the cross over to reveal an inscription on the back. "For Eleanor, be brave, be kind, be true. Love always, Papa." "I want this to be part of the exhibit," Eleanor said firmly. "People should understand that my father's decision wasn't just political or economic. It was spiritual. He believed he had a moral obligation to resist injustice, even if resistance cost him everything." Sarah accepted the cross with appropriate reverence, understanding that Eleanor was entrusting her with something far more precious than a simple artifact. The cross represented the core of who Henry Blackwood had been. Not just a successful businessman or a murder victim, but a man of faith who had chosen conscience over safety. That evening, as they prepared the new items for display, Sarah reflected on how the historical preserve had evolved beyond a simple memorial. It had become a meditation on the choices people make when faced with impossible circumstances, a reminder that ordinary individuals sometimes find themselves called to extraordinary courage. The restored Bible would be displayed in a climate-controlled case, open to the page where Henry had written his final spiritual reflection. March 22, 1963. "If this is my last night on earth, I want my daughter to know that I chose love over fear, truth over comfort, principle over profit. I pray she will be proud of the choice I made." Emma helped Sarah arrange the new display, her young hands careful and respectful as she positioned the Bible and cross alongside Henry's other personal items. "Do you think Henry is watching us?" Emma asked quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I think that if he is, he's proud that people remember not just how he died, but how he lived. And he'd be especially proud that children like you and Jake are learning from his story." As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the cabin in warm golden light, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. Henry's story was now fully told, preserved not just in documents and recordings, but in the living testament of a community that had learned to value courage, truth, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. The restored Bible would teach visitors about Henry's spiritual foundation. The hand-carved cross would remind them of his love for his daughter, and the photographs would show them the human faces of everyone affected by his final, fatal decision to choose principle over pragmatism. But perhaps most importantly, Eleanor's gifts would help future generations understand that heroes aren't born different from everyone else. They're ordinary people who, when tested, choose to live by their highest values, regardless of the personal cost. The final court hearing took place on a gray November morning in Helena, Montana's federal courthouse. Sarah sat in the gallery with Eleanor, Agent Martinez, and Dorothy Chen from the library, watching as the last legal threads of Henry Blackwood's 30-year-old case were finally tied together. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname, reviewed the settlement documents with the thorough attention of someone who understood the historical significance of the case before her. "In the matter of Blackwood Estate versus United States federal government," she announced, "the court finds that the federal seizure of property belonging to Henry James Blackwood was conducted without proper legal authority and in violation of constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure. The settlement was comprehensive. Beyond the financial compensation Sarah had already received, the federal government formally acknowledged wrongdoing, agreed to fund the historical preserve in perpetuity, and committed to policy changes designed to prevent similar abuses in the future." But for Sarah, the most important document was simpler: a new property deed that officially transferred complete ownership of Henry's land to her family, along with ironclad protections against any future federal seizure attempts. "The property deed has been updated to include mineral rights in perpetuity," the judge continued, "and the land has been designated as a historical preserve with permanent protection status. No future development or extraction activities may occur without the explicit consent of the current property owners." Eleanor squeezed Sarah's hand as the judge spoke. After decades of wondering, worrying, and waiting, Henry Blackwood's daughter could finally rest, knowing that her father's death had not been in vain. Outside the courthouse, Agent Martinez briefed the small group on the final outcomes of the criminal investigation. Deputy Director Harrison received 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. 3 of his subordinates received lesser sentences in exchange for cooperation. The mining company executives are facing separate federal charges for fraud and racketeering. Sarah felt a satisfaction that was both deep and complicated. Justice had been served, but it had taken 30 years and cost Henry his life. The men responsible for his death would face consequences, but those consequences could never restore the years Eleanor had lost without her father, or the future Henry had been denied. "There's one more thing," Martinez added, handing Sarah an official-looking envelope. "The FBI director asked me to give you this personally." Inside was a letter of commendation, recognizing Sarah's exceptional courage in exposing government corruption and ensuring that justice was served despite significant personal risk. The letter was signed not only by the FBI director, but by the Attorney General and several other federal officials. "We don't usually do this for civilian witnesses," Martinez explained, "but your case has already led to policy changes at multiple federal agencies. You've helped ensure that what happened to Henry Blackwood can't happen to other families in the future." That afternoon, Sarah drove Eleanor to Billings Airport for her flight back to Portland. The two women had become far more than connected by tragedy. They were friends who had helped each other heal from wounds that had seemed permanent. "I want you to have this," Eleanor said as they waited at the departure gate, pulling a small wrapped package from her carry-on bag. Inside was Henry's pocket watch, the same timepiece Martha had given to Sarah months earlier, but Eleanor had had it professionally restored and engraved with a new inscription on the back. "For Sarah, Emma, and Jake Morrison, time shared with love is time well spent. Thank you for giving my father's story the ending he deserved. With gratitude always, Eleanor." "I can't accept this," Sarah protested. "It belongs in your family. It does belong in family," Eleanor replied firmly, "and you and your children are family now. Henry would want his watch to be with people who understand its value, who will pass on its lessons to future generations." Sarah held the watch, feeling its steady tick against her palm. The inscription was perfect, a reminder that time was precious, that every moment offered opportunities to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience. "Promise me something," Eleanor said as boarding began for her flight. "Promise me that you'll continue to use Henry's story to help other people. Don't let his sacrifice become just another historical curiosity." "I promise," Sarah replied, meaning every word. That evening, Sarah returned to the cabin carrying more than just legal documents and commendations. She carried the weight of responsibility to Henry's memory, to Eleanor's trust, and to the principle that justice delayed is not justice denied as long as someone is willing to keep fighting for truth. Emma and Jake were waiting in the kitchen with a celebration dinner they'd prepared themselves, sandwiches cut into festive shapes, and juice served in the good glasses they usually saved for special occasions. "Is it really over?" Emma asked, as they sat down to eat. Sarah looked around the room that had become the center of their lives, at the children who had grown strong and confident over the past year, at the historical preserve that ensured Henry's story would be told for generations to come. "The legal part is over," she said, "but the important part, making sure people remember why Henry's story matters, that's just beginning." Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, blanketing the Montana mountains in pristine white. Inside the cabin Henry Blackwood had built with his own hands, his legacy lived on in the laughter of children who would grow up understanding that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the cabin's restored kitchen, watching Emma and Jake carefully place items into a sealed metal container that would become their family's time capsule. The autumn light streaming through the windows was the same golden color that had illuminated their first desperate morning in this place, but everything else had changed beyond recognition. "What should we write for people who find this in the future?" Emma asked, her pen poised over a sheet of paper. At 10 years old, she had become the family's unofficial historian, documenting their journey with the same careful attention to detail that Henry had shown in his own records. "Tell them about courage," Jake suggested, adding a photograph of their renovated cabin to the container. "Tell them that even when bad things happen, good people can make them better." Sarah smiled at her 7-year-old son's wisdom. In the past year, Jake had grown from a frightened little boy into someone who understood instinctively that hope was a choice people made, not something that happened to them accidentally. "We should tell them about Henry," Emma said, including a copy of the Historical Preserves dedication program in the time capsule. "About how he saved evidence for 30 years so that someone like us could finally tell the truth." The dedication ceremony had taken place the previous month, with visitors coming from across the country to honor Henry Blackwood's memory and learn about the importance of protecting individual rights against government overreach. Eleanor had returned for the event, officially transferring her father's remaining artifacts to the permanent collection. But the ceremony had been more than just a memorial service. It had become a celebration of the community that had grown around Henry's story. The families Sarah had helped through her advocacy work. The students who had learned about civic responsibility through the preserve's educational programs. The legal scholars who had used the case to strengthen protections for property owners throughout the country. "I want to include this too," Sarah said, adding a copy of her college degree to the time capsule. She had graduated from Montana State University's history program the previous spring, writing her senior thesis on government accountability and citizen advocacy. The degree represented more than personal achievement. It symbolized the transformation from victim to empowered advocate that had defined her entire journey. Emma carefully folded her letter and placed it in the container. Sarah read over her daughter's shoulder as Emma wrote, "To whoever finds this time capsule, we want you to know that this cabin was built by a brave man named Henry Blackwood, who died protecting what he believed in. Our family found his hidden evidence and used it to make sure the truth was finally told. We learned that sometimes good people have to fight bad people, but the good people can win if they don't give up. We hope you will be good people too." The time capsule would be buried beneath the oak tree behind the cabin, in a spot marked by a simple stone bearing Henry's initials. Future generations would find not just artifacts and letters, but the story of how ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they chose courage over comfort. "Mum, do you think we'll still be living here when someone finds this?" Jake asked as Sarah sealed the container with wax to protect it from moisture. Sarah looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their home. The same room where she'd first discovered Henry's hidden papers now served as headquarters for her consulting business, which had grown to help families across the region protect their property rights. The same table where she'd spread out mysterious maps now hosted homework sessions, business meetings, and community gatherings. "I hope so," she replied honestly, "but even if we're not, the important things will still be here." Henry's story, the historical preserve, the lessons about standing up for what's right, those things will outlast any of us. As they walked outside to bury the time capsule, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. They'd arrived as refugees from a failed marriage and lost dreams, seeking nothing more than basic shelter from an uncertain world. They were leaving behind for future discoverers the record of a family that had found purpose, community, and the knowledge that some stories are too important to remain buried. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from the cabin's chimney and the earthiness of fallen leaves. Emma and Jake took turns with the shovel, carefully covering their time capsule with Montana soil that had kept Henry's secrets safe for 3 decades. "Do you think Henry knows what happened?" Emma asked as they placed the memorial stone over the burial site. Sarah looked up at the mountains that surrounded their home, the same peaks Henry had seen during his final days of fear and courage. "I think he knows that truth survived, just like he hoped it would, and I think he's proud that his cabin is still sheltering people who understand the difference between right and wrong." That evening, as the first winter storm of the season began dropping snow on the mountains, Sarah sat by the fireplace, with Henry's pocket watch in her hands. Its steady ticking measured moments that connected past to future, tragedy to triumph, one generation's sacrifice to another's opportunity. Outside, the wind that had once carried Henry's final radio transmissions now sang through trees that would shelter the time capsule until some future family discovered it and learned that courage, like truth, has a way of surviving even the darkest times. The watch ticked steadily in the warm cabin light, counting precious moments in a story that would continue long after its current chapter had ended.